Growing up, the most expensive piece of furniture in my house was the dining room table. And to this day, if you walk into my mom's house, the dining room table is still the first thing you see when you look to the right. To be honest, I've only seen the legs of this table because it's covered by an inch-thick table protector and a tablecloth. Not to mention, it's only been in the last 10 years that I've been invited to sit at this table. See, all of my childhood memories surrounding holidays and birthday parties involve me sitting at the kids' table, even at my own birthday party. You know what I mean when I say the kids' table, right? The kids' table is a clear line of distinction between the adults, people considered contributing members of society, and the children. When you're 5, it's awesome. When you're 13, not so much. At 13, you actually want to eat what the adults are eating, instead of just mac and cheese and dinner rolls. And you don't want to sit at the cheap table with cheap silverware. You want to sit at the super fancy dining room table. Sadly, there were only so many spots at my mom's dining room table. You could languish at the kids' table until your mid-20s, and usually someone had to move away before you got the invitation to move up. But the kids' table isn't just at my mom's place. Our world is filled with direct and indirect, subtle and not so subtle kids' tables. Think about it. Let's say there's a group of 4 single roommates who are best friends. 3 of them get married and move out. Time passes and they all get together and hang out. But now one of them likely still feels like they're at the kids' table. Or say you're a young married couple and it seems like all the young married couples you know are getting pregnant and buying a house. But you're not pregnant and you're in an apartment. All of a sudden, you feel like you're at the kids' table. Or maybe you have friends or coworkers who talk about their retirement or investment funds and you're still trying to figure out how to pay off your credit card debt. I could go on for days. I think if we're honest, we'd admit that most of us are very aware of how we fit in, or don't fit in, compared to everybody else. We might use a lot of different words to describe how we internally evaluate ourselves, but ultimately it comes down to this: self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is what drives us to ask ourselves questions like, am I successful enough? Am I making enough money? Is my family put together well enough? Am I a good enough parent? Am I doing enough for my kids? Am I healthy enough? That list can go on and on too. Self-consciousness is the thing that makes us feel like we're sitting at the kids' table. So here's a question. Is there a person or place in your life that makes you feel self-conscious? That makes you feel like you're sitting at the kids' table? Whether it's Facebook, work, the gym, a family gathering, or our kids' Little League games. There are a lot of places that can make us feel self-conscious. And for a lot of people, church even fits in that category too. Sadly, the church can often feel like a giant kids' table for sinners. A few weeks ago, I noticed the mom in our church had stopped going to her usual service and began going to a later service. After a few weeks, I asked her about the change, and her answer kind of shocked me. She said that since her divorce, she didn't go to her usual service because that was the service that had most families. She said the later service had more people who were single or in recovery groups, so that was her new home. It was as if she was saying that our church had a kids' table service. We had one service where broken people felt like they belonged, and one where they didn't. And so I wondered, isn't the church supposed to be one big table? A table where anyone is welcome? Because Jesus dined with sinners, shouldn't we be a place where everyone gets a seat at the big table? Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the story of the prodigal son. If you're not familiar with the story, you've probably heard the word prodigal used in reference to someone who's wild or someone who ran off or impulsively moved away. But before we look at the story of the prodigal son, I want to ask a question. Why did Jesus tell this story? Whenever you read a story or a teaching from Jesus, it's important to remember that he never pulled teaching ideas out of thin air. Often he told stories to respond to a question or to address one of the central debates of his day. For example, Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan as a response to a common debate people were having when answering the question, who is my neighbor? Through the Good Samaritan, Jesus widened the circle in the Jewish mind of who was considered a neighbor. It wasn't just someone who lived in your village or shared your values. Your neighbor included people who looked differently, believed differently, and came from different places than you, like the dreaded Samaritans. The idea behind this story sounds obvious today, but it was shocking to the original audience. The story of the prodigal son is very similar. During the time of Jesus, there was a raging debate about table fellowship. In other words, about who you shared your table with, about who you ate with, and who you didn't. In the Jewish world, eating a meal with someone wasn't just about sharing food. It was a way to dignify one another. It was a sign of respect and inclusion. The Gospel of Luke more than any other gospel, shows how Jesus dealt with this issue and handled the table fellowship debate. In other gospels, Jesus restores people by healing them, teaching them, and forgiving them. In the Gospel of Luke, however, Jesus often restores people by eating with them. In fact, Jesus talks about food constantly in Luke's version of events. The story of the prodigal son is told in Luke 15, starting in verse 11. However, the stage and audience for this story is laid out 11 verses earlier. Here's what it says. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So the audience was filled with tax collectors and Pharisees. This was a tense crowd. Tax collectors in the world of Jesus were hardened criminals. They stole money from the poor and had no shame. First off, they were collecting taxes from the Jewish people for the Romans, an enemy occupier. They were stealing from their Jewish brothers and sisters and working for the enemy. If that wasn't bad enough, tax collectors would overcharge and take money off the top for themselves. In our world, they'd be convicted for extortion. Pharisees had a real issue with the tax collectors, and for a good reason. On this particular day, the Pharisees had a problem with Jesus because the rumor was that Jesus had eaten some meals with tax collectors. And that brought the issue of table fellowship front and center. This wasn't about chips and salsa. This was about dignity. The Pharisees were angry that Jesus was eating with people who didn't deserve to be dignified. The translation of Luke 15:1 is essentially, Jesus had invited people to sit at the adults' table who should be at the kids' table. But while the Pharisees were drawing lines, Jesus was building a table. To Jesus, all were welcome. Jesus was giving dignity to people who had lost it. Now, if I were Jesus, I'd defend myself. But he didn't. Instead, he told a story. In reality, he told three. In the first story, he says that God is like a shepherd who owns 100 sheep. When the shepherd realized that one was lost, he ran after it. He was trying to tell the Pharisees in this moment, this is how God treats sinners. In the second story, Jesus says that God is like a housewife who loses a coin. She had 10, but she frantically looked for the one that had gotten away. When she found it, she celebrated. Again, Jesus tells this story to show what God is like, how he values people. Jesus then tells the third story, the story of the prodigal son, which we'll look at over these next few weeks. He essentially tells the story to say God is like a father who had lost a son. When his son returned, God didn't ask questions, he just celebrated. This is what God is like. The point of these three stories is to say that there is no kids' table in the economy of God. In other words, everyone is welcome to eat at the table of God. If at any point religion makes someone feel less than because of their sin, it has missed the point. If we ever elevate a rule over a person, we've missed the point. If we ever favor a law over a lawbreaker, we've missed the point. Because Jesus went out of his way to invite everyone to God's table. Over the next few weeks, we'll dive into the details of the story of the prodigal son. But in the meantime, here are two questions to think about. Do you know anyone who feels like they've lost dignity? And have you broken rules and feel like you're on the outside looking in? I think Jesus tells this story in part to claim that his vision for the church isn't a bunch of pews or seats in rows, but one big table. Now, I'd imagine there are people in this room who feel like they don't belong. Maybe you're one of those people, and maybe you feel this way because of your divorce, or because you're a single mom, or because of your financial struggles, because of your race, because of your background or lack of education, because of your lack of understanding about church or the Bible, and you're self-conscious, feeling like there's something that has placed you at the kids' table. In the Bible, however, Jesus never catered to those at the top of the food chain. He always stood with the people at the bottom or in the margins. Today, many of us still feel marginalized by someone. You aren't enough of something for someone. Someone has put you at the kids' table. I don't want you to ever forget this. Throughout his life, Jesus loved to eat at the kids' table. I truly believe that we're never more like Jesus than when we give dignity to someone who's lost it. It's my tendency to pat myself on the back for how much of the Bible I know, or how often I go to church. The indicator of our spiritual health, however, is not how high our hands go up in worship. It's how long our table extends to those who are broken. And the truth is, I don't think our world is that different from the world in which Jesus lived. A meal can still be sacred. A meal is still a way to dignify someone. This week, what if you decided to have a meal with someone you normally wouldn't? Someone who isn't in your economic bracket. Someone who isn't in your sphere of friends. Because the truth is, there is someone outside of your race or code of ethics who needs dignity. There's no simpler way to be like Jesus than to eat a meal with them. When you have a meal with someone, it's impossible not to hear their story, and it's impossible not to listen. If inviting someone for a meal doesn't work this week, then at the very least, do the cell phone test. At least once a week, I need to remind myself to look at my call and text history. Do I only interact with people who look, talk, and believe like I do? Does my phone history show that I've been interacting with people at the kids' table? Does it reveal that I'm building a big table for everyone? Building a table for everyone requires intentionality. It's not always easy. It's often messy, but it's a beautiful reflection of the heart of Jesus. Imagine if we became the kind of church that saw every meal as an opportunity to give dignity to someone. Everyone is welcome to eat at the table of God. And in a world of dividing lines, Jesus invites us to build bigger tables.